You're tuned to Radio Caroline on 199, your all-day music station.
Radio Atlanta on our very first day, our Champers Day, bringing you brighter broadcasting and the finest sounds around.
Within the next few minutes, some lucky Radio Caroline listener could win as much as 1,560 quid.
This is Radio Caroline International.
This is the new Radio Caroline.
Mi amigo, mi amigo, mi amigo.
Radio Caroline.
This is not just a story about a radio station. It's about an idea that revolutionized the structure of radio in the United Kingdom and influenced the development of the British record market. It's a story about disc jockeys, engineers, pop groups, advertisers, and millions of radio listeners. For this is the story of Radio Caroline.
Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline.
The man who started Radio Caroline was an Irish businessman. His name, Ronan O'Rahilly.
I had been involved in the music business quite heavily. I got involved with, in fact I remember it well, I was involved in the club game, and then a friend of mine, a guy called Giorgio Gomelski, came to see me and said, come and listen to a band, you know. So off I went and I listened to a band called Alexis Corner Rhythm and Blues Band. And in that band there was Charlie Watts on drums, later joined the Stones. There was Jack Bruce. Ginger Baker joined the band when Charlie Watts left. But that was how I first sort of got a taste of the music scene. I discovered then that when I brought another artist I was working on called Georgie Fame, I brought a recording of Georgie around to a number of the record companies. In fact, a number. There were two record companies that counted then, EMI and Decca, and they had a total monopoly of the industry. They owned the distribution outlets, and they controlled, as I later found out, they controlled every piece of airtime on Radio Luxembourg. I mean, 70% of it. There were two other small companies, Pye and Phillips, who had, I think between them about 12% of the market or something, because they had a little bit of airtime on Luxembourg. They had about equivalent amount of time. And no other record company could break that. I mean, it was an absolute solid monopoly. So I went to the two companies, EMI and Decca, with the recording of Georgia, and I was told them, both places, that it was too early for coloured singers in Britain, which I was amused by, considering he was a Lancashire lad. Anyway, I then decided, right, I'm going to record him myself and go that route. I wasn't conscious at all, by the way, at this point, of the monopoly. I just thought they just happened to be four record companies, and I didn't tie up anything else with it until I found myself sitting in Luxembourg with an acetate of Georgie and asking the then Luxembourg people, how many plays can you give me on this artist? I'm going to bring it out on my own record company. And the guy sort of almost fell off the chair laughing, that anyone could be so ignorant or naive or whatever you like to call it. And he showed me these charts and wallboards on the wall with EMI show, Decca show, EMI show, Decca show, EMI show, Decca show. I mean, it was just absolutely, and then a tiny little Pi show and a tiny little Philips show down at the end, So that virtually the entire Luxembourg airtime. So I went to the Beeb then, and the Beeb said they only played established artists on their one program a week or whatever it was. I can't even remember now. But I know they had, I think, a Top of the Pops show and one or two other shows. I mean, there was so little exposure in the UK at that time. I mean, during the day, you just couldn't hear pop music. I mean, it was just barren, We went on and, at this point, and I thought to myself, my God, this is... And I remember sitting to the guy, because my mind just worked logically. And I said, well, look, if that is the case, then obviously the next step is to, if you're not going to give me airtime, the next thing is to start a radio station. The next logical... as you go through each stage, you have an artist that you think should have exposure. You go to the first stage and you find that the record companies don't want it, so you have to start your own record company. Then you find that if you have your own record company, nobody will play the thing because it's all tied up in a monopoly situation. You go to the next step, which is you start a radio station. And I said it to them there in that very morning. I wasn't sort of thinking about it for 6 weeks. I just said, bang, bang, that's what you've got to do.
Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline!
I was very plugged into the Kennedys, right? And I was a big, big fan of the Kennedys. From 1959, when I first sort of saw John Kennedy on television, dialoguing and laying down just the whole vibe of him was got me like it got millions of other people all over the world. And I remember traveling across to the States to buy the transmitter gear, and I remember having this Look magazine or Life magazine, and there was a picture of Caroline Kennedy disrupting government. I remember that was she was in the cabinet room or in his office or something. There was a meeting going on, and she sort of climbed out from under the desk and disrupted everything, right? And instead of Jack Kennedy sort of having one of his aides, get rid of her, I'm in an important meeting, he got involved with her, leaving, all these serious, powerful men sitting around twiddling their thumbs. That was the story behind that. And the photograph that actually they had spread across the page, if I remember, was her climbing out from under the desk, sort of all smiles, and the headline was Caroline, upsets the apple cart, I mean, there's that kind of imagery. It was the smile, the whole idea of the whole Kennedy kind of idea, which was to break new ground, to open new, to expand, etc. To, just a whole kind of the best of free enterprise with a lot of soul, In other words, that combination, which I think, I've always thought was a very healthy combination. And it was just that whole imagery, and it was the headline, the Caroline thing, and I said, bang, that's it.
Caroline, sound of a nation. Caroline, sound of a land. Caroline, the sound of a nation. Caroline.
I later discovered, for instance, the most popular name in England, in fact, the most popular girl's name in England is Caroline.
Simon D. explains.
We flew from Heathrow with a guy called Chris Moore, who was a sort of early program director, American friend of Ronan's, and we flew from Heathrow to Dublin, and then we drove on the coast road right up to Greenore, where I always remember it was the evening, and we came over a slight hill, and looking down on the port of Greenore, it sounds terribly romantic, but it really was beautiful. And way down the bottom was this slender steel needle, which was the mast of Caroline, which is about 120 feet high. and that's where we started work on fitting out the first boat to get there, which was Ronan's boat, the Baltic ferry boat Caroline. When we were there, coming over from Texas was the Mi Amigo, which was Crawford's boat. Well, we were getting on with the ship, we were gradually getting it together, and then on the horizon came the Mi Amigo, which had managed to batter its way across the Atlantic in appalling weather, saying, "Hey, you ready for us? Here we are, we want a bit of this number, we want a bit of this harbour, and we want to be fitted out too, of course." See? So, there then developed rather a bit of, shall we say, slightly unacceptable behaviour from all of us, because the basic thing was here were two ships at one port, and both independent bosses, Ronan and Allen, both wanted the London anchorage. There were going to be two anchorages. There was going to be one off Frinton, and there was going to be one off the Isle of Man. Consequently, we were covering the whole of the UK. But both of us knew that the London anchorage up the Thames estuary was the richer of the two as far as commercials were concerned. So we both were aiming for this, so we both wanted to finish first. Well, Mi Amigo anchored behind us in Greenore, and one night we did a commando raid on board, because the Mi Amigo had what were called Spotmaster cassettes, and we didn't have Spotmasters, folks, and Spotmaster cassettes bring up commercials instantly, so you can sort of do amazing things and sound terribly professional. We didn't have any of these, so we mounted a Red Beret raid. Unfortunately, we weren't very good, because we were caught on board the ship by hordes of shrieking Dutch sailors, who probably drinking hordes of Dutch gin too. Anyway, it was a whole amazing scene, and sort of Spotmasters were being clutched, and people were swearing at each other in various languages. So we turned out of Greenore, having fitted out the ship, and with the crew on board. There was Chris Moore and myself. Chris Moore and myself were the only two voices on board, as far as I can remember, English voices. There were lots of Dutch people there, crew, electronics engineers, and the captain. We sailed away from Greenore, and this was on the Monday of Easter week 1964, and then at exactly 7 o'clock on Good Friday evening 1964 we dropped anchor, and it was dark, it was black, it was blowing a gale, the rain was coming down, it was amazing, and we could only see a few flashing lights ashore. People were running around the ship, and we decided, of course, knowing that we were going on air the following day, Easter Saturday, we'd have to test. We tested the equipment, and it seemed to work. It was pitch black, and we went to bed. Not that we really slept. We got up in the morning, and we had the tapes ready in the control cabin. We were not going to do live records because we weren't too sure of the equipment in the sea rocking, so we had tapes for the first transmission, but we had to go live. The actual first announcement had to be live, obviously. So we waited for it to get light. Anyway, it was getting closer to the time. The gale was still going. I was reasonably nervous, of course. Everyone was nervous. Everything was ready. It was 11:30, and we checked the sig tune of Caroline, which was Jimmy McGriff playing Round Midnight, which was the code music of the station. We checked that a couple of times. I think the playing time of that track was something like 3 minutes 35, so allowing 30 seconds or so for speech. We started it at 4 minutes to noon. It finished at 30 seconds to noon. Then I flipped the live switch and I said, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Radio Caroline on 199, your all-day music station. We're transmitting music from now until 6 o'clock this evening, and a whole lot of other rhubarb, I said, I can't remember. And one of the big 12-inch spools of tape started moving, and I cut myself out, and zap, and Caroline was on the air.
And when finally, 12 o'clock arrived, and suddenly, in she came, it was amazing. It wasn't amazing. I mean, you can't really describe the feeling. It's an impossible thing to describe.
Of course, together with this first transmission, we had the famous Caroline bell, which was one of the characteristic sounds of the early days of Caroline. We'd bought a bell, and it figured on our publicity material, and that was ding, 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 ding. And that was always the case. Whenever we did any station breaks or changed programs in those first days, we always had the bell on a Spotmaster. And we know how we got those. So we were able to put the bell in.
The time is 3 o'clock, and you are listening to a program from Radio Caroline.
I knew in my own head that it was going to catch on. I had no doubt about that at all.
Radio Caroline opened this weekend. The ship can be seen from Felixstowe Beach. It started broadcasting on the 28th of March on 199 meters and closed down at 6 p.m. It resumed broadcasting at 6 a.m. next morning. It's understood it will continue to broadcast 12 hours non-stop programming of pop and light music.
For the first time in British history, the BBC radio monopoly had been shattered. Radio Caroline was playing what the listeners wanted, non-stop music. It gave tremendous exposure to unknown artists, and its effect could very soon be seen through the national record charts. But to millions of listeners, it was just great entertainment.
Caroline's Sure Shot.
What do the Caroline DJs look like? Well, you know the voices, but what about the faces? Well, of course, when you join the Caroline Club, your problem is solved. Membership automatically entitles you to photographs of Caroline's disc jockeys. And if the one you want isn't in your initial Caroline Club membership packet, there's a special service at Caroline House to give club members all the information they require. Join now. Send 5 shillings to Caroline Club, Membership Department, 6 Chesterfield Gardens, London, West 1.
You may not find us on your TV, because in case you did not know, we're being brought to you on. Brought to you on. Brought to you by RADI. Oh.
Hey, guys,
Johnny Desmond there with the theme from the recently released picture from 20th Century Fox, Rio Conchos. And we are very lucky to have a couple of the stars from that very movie in the play.
After only a few days on the air, Radio Caroline's London office received thousands of letters. An estimated 7 million listeners were tuning in every day.
The reaction to Caroline was unbelievable. I mean, we discovered that we had, within like 10 days, 7,200,000 listeners. I mean, actual listeners in that period.
We didn't really know how many people. We hoped a few thousand, but we had no conception. On the first day that the tender arrived, it drew up alongside. There was a very heavy swell, I always remember, and the tender was almost coming up level with the deck. It was so high, and then it would sink right down again alongside the side of Caroline, and up it would come again. And getting on and off that was quite a tricky operation, sometimes. But this occasion came, and I looked over the edge of the ship, and down on the tender's deck were sacks and sacks and sacks of vegetables that we wanted. Anyway, they brought all this stuff on board, and it wasn't vegetables, it was mail. Sacks and sacks and sacks of mail. And then it was then that I learnt the power of radio, really direct radio. It was a truly staggering example of immediate rapport.
Caroline, the sound of the nation.
The immediate reaction of the government was to declare that the station was illegal. But in fact, any ship broadcasting from outside territorial waters is a perfectly legal enterprise under international convention. On the 9th of May 1964, another radio station joined Caroline in its fight against the monopoly.
Radio Atlanta, Britain's second pirate radio station anchored off Frinton-on-Sea, Essex, began broadcasting on Saturday night.
On 201 meters, this is Radio Atlanta, and the time is 6 o'clock. That's the show. Enjoyed your company, hope you enjoyed the music. Be back with you at 1 o'clock tomorrow for Headline Hits. Till then, from your man with the music, Tony Withers, see you around.
Alan Crawford rang me. He used to be an awfully nice fellow as managing director of Southern Music in Australia. And he used to court me, as all the boys did, because I was, the big boy in Australia. But you make your friends. Ken East, who was EMI, and just recently managing director of EMI here for the world, was a great serving mate of mine. Alan Crawford was a good fellow. Lots of fun and into the pub and everything. And he said, I'm going to do this thing, which quite astounded me. Then as he talked, I could see the potential of it. And I remember Easter, when Caroline opened, we were absolutely flabbergasted. And in beating us, got £1 million of publicity, because there's no doubt about it, not only here in Britain, but the whole world. When they think of pirate radio, they think of Caroline.
Radio Atlanta's programs were being beamed from the MV Mi Amigo, a 470-ton ship that had previously been used by a Swedish pirate station called Radio Nord. On the 2nd of July 1964, a merger of the two stations was announced.
The directors of Project Atlanta and Planet Productions Limited today issued a joint statement announcing a merger between Radio Atlanta and Radio Caroline. The companies are responsible for the advertising and selling of time on the two offshore commercial radio stations. Mr. Alan Crawford, Managing Director of Project Atlanta, and Mr. Ronan O'Reilly, Managing Director of Planet Productions, will become joint Managing Directors of the new operation. The ship broadcasting the present Radio Caroline programs, MV Caroline, will sail to the Isle of Man tomorrow morning to a position 5 miles from Ramsey, Isle of Man. It will continue to broadcast Radio Caroline programs on the way to its destination and remain on 199 meters medium wave. The ship broadcasting the present Radio Atlanta, MV Mi Amigo, will continue broadcasting from its present position to the Greater London area and southeast England under the national call sign Radio Caroline.
One night, we upped anchor. Suddenly the engine started. What? Engine starting? What's happening? My goodness, and there was a throb throughout the ship, and everything starts to quiver, and then it slows down. And this was about 10 o'clock at night, and suddenly we're moving. And we go down the coast. We turned round and we came up behind Atlanta. I can remember I was right up on the bow, watching everyone doing things, and we tied up to the stern of Atlanta. And people jumped off our ship and went in to see the captain. And they were there for about an hour, drinking more Dutch gin and everything. Cut a long story short, we were on 199 meters and Atlanta was on 197 or something like this, very small difference in frequency. And we were going to change crystals. Our 199 crystal was going to be given to Atlanta, and Atlanta was going to give Caroline 197. Atlanta would stay anchored in the south of East England. As far as they are concerned, transmitting on 199 with my voice and a few other people's voices, so that as far as the public were concerned, nothing had changed, but as far as we were concerned, the whole ship had changed. Whereas our ship, now adopting Atlantis Crystal, was taking Atlantis crew, was sailing back to the Isle of Man, and it was going to anchor and open up Northwestern Broadcasting. And the next day, we upped anchor, sailed past Atlanta, dropping off myself, another disc jockey called Doug Carr, and a whole lot of records and gear, and then it sailed on, leaving us to and we took the Crystal with us. When we got to Atlanta, of course, it wasn't geared for records, it was geared for tape, and we had no needles to play records. And the Caroline was disappearing down the channel, away, and we were sitting on this boat with no needles. And we went to the captain, who didn't like this deal, right? He was quite happy sitting on his ship, drinking gin with a few tapes going. He didn't have any freaks rushing around with records and requests and everything. So he said, "Needles? What needles? We have no needles. No needles." We said, "Of course you got needles." "No, we have never got the needles on the ship." Well, for about 4 hours, right, until he got really stoned, he wouldn't give us the needles. Eventually, at 3 o'clock in the morning, he gave us the needles. And at 6 a.m. we had to go on the air as Radio Caroline on 199. Ding ding, your all-day music station on a completely new ship with new needles, new equipment, all our big LP collection gone on Caroline. We just took the top 20 with us so we could keep the kids amused, right, with the top 20 material, top 50 or something like that. And a few LPs that I had clutched under each arm as we jumped ship. And at 3 o'clock he gave us the needles. And so I think it was by literally something like 20 to 6 that morning we finally got the needles wired up. I think eventually with chewing gum we eventually did the wiring on the arms. Doug was chewing gum all the time and passing it to me, and I was sticking there, saying, "Chew some more." And at 6 o'clock we went on the air. The great British public had no idea that in the previous 48 hours we'd changed crystals, crews, all that. And that's what happened, and that's how Atlanta became Caroline South, and how Caroline became Caroline North, and we never saw each other again.
Radio on Go-Go.
From the north of England, you're in line with the Go-Go Boys of Caroline.
It's the big boy wonderful Willie of the Deafy Dirty
Frederica was much bigger than the Mi Amigo. The living conditions were much better on there. We had our own private cabin, various other things that we had on that boat that we didn't have on the Mi Amigo. And I found that I'm not being prejudiced when I say this now, but I found that the people up north were much friendlier. The mail absolutely trebled in comparison from the south. And I discovered that after coming off the ship and visiting places like Liverpool, Blackpool, and various places like that, we were treated like gods, you know. And I spent about 2.5 years, the happiest years of my life on this ship.
Presenting Caroline's Men of a New Breed.
Music, that's our middle name.
Jerry Super Layton.
Daffy Don Allen. Baby Bob Stewart.
Mick loves it.
Tony the Prince. Jerry King. They're Caroline's Men of a New Breed. The men who make radio active.
Music, that's our middle name. Music.
It was not long before other pirate stations came on the air, like Radio Such, Radio Invicta, and Radio King. But Caroline did not face any serious commercial competition until the highly Americanized Radio London arrived off Walton-on-the-Naze shortly before Christmas 1964. It dropped anchor just a mile away from the MV Mi Amigo.
Wonderful, wonderful Radio London. Radio London.
And in the following year, more stations arrived, each with a different format.
around the clock. For all the best in music, turn to us around the clock. For news and information, turn to us around the clock. For sounds of the smart set, now don't you forget, turn to Hallmark of Quality Britain Radio.
Terry Bate, Caroline's sales manager, takes up the story.
I traveled back and forth for 10, 12 consecutive weekends looking at England, talking to agencies, listening to radio, before we actually made the decision to get involved. And the main point was that radio had no believability, great deal of amateur enthusiasm on air, no professionalism, particularly in the sales operation. And this was the biggest single lack. And this was kind of the first job. It was to produce some kind of professional sales organization.
Bang on target with Caroline Sales. Sell on Radio Caroline now and count the profits later. Caroline can sell your business, your service, to millions for as little as £10 a time. Radio Caroline reaches people all hours of the day, at home, at work, in the car. They'll hear your message. They'll buy your product. Sell on Radio Caroline now. Contact Caroline Sales, 6 Chesterfield Gardens, London, West 1. Ring Hyde Park, 9721.
The brief was to make Caroline make money, which initially, although they had obviously great success in audience, the revenue didn't entirely match the audience. And as commercial operation, it was not entirely the most successful at that stage of the game. And the brief was very simple: to do whatever is necessary to make money, whether it be bring in revenue or cut down costs. The general attitude of agencies was that, and advertisers, was that, okay, it exists, a lot of people out there, we don't know if it works, we'll throw a few quid of the client's money in. If it works, we can be a hero. If not, what the hell. And radio, which certainly went against my grain, was considered to be a poor cousin to everything else that was around.
4 kinds of Sunsilk shampoo.
One is for you.
4 kinds of Sunsilk shampoo, because there are 4 kinds of hair. What's your hair type? Normal? Then you need Clear Gold and Sunsilk to keep it lovely. Greasy and lank, you need deep cleansing Sunsilk Lemon. Lots of girls have dry hair. Do you? You need gentle Sunsilk with Lanolin Cream. And if your hair's just a little bit dull, Sunsilk Tonic will give it a beautiful shine. So whatever type of hair you have, there's a Sunsilk shampoo to make it more beautiful.
4 kinds of Sunsilk shampoo.
Cash Casino was probably the first programming and sales thing that we put together. There was no in-depth research, there was no believability amongst agencies that it actually sold any product. Cash Casino was designed to do one very simple thing, and that was to prove that we could sell some merchandise. We packaged it in 5 segments, and we asked for labels or reasonable facsimiles. We ran the first flight for 11 weeks and pulled millions and millions of labels and letters and so on. And we dumped them on clients' front lawns to prove that we could sell merchandise, etc., etc., etc.
Within the next few minutes, some lucky Radio Caroline listener could win more than £3,320. So let's play Caroline Cash Casino. Presented by these quality products: Findus Frozen Foods, Libby's, Weetabix, and Alberto VO5 Shampoo. This segment is brought to you by Findus Frozen Food. And so we go into our second letter, get it open here, and inside we find the correct enclosure, Findus Garden Peas. And our letter comes from Mrs. S. Montserrat, Ruskin, Albion Crescent, Chalfont St. Giles in Bucks. And this is beautifully typewritten, I must say. It says, after considering all the clues so far, and with the help of a patient husband, I think that they lead to Geoff Hurst, who played such an important role in the winning of the World Cup for England. That is it! By golly, it is! Oh, my heavens! Yes, 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 that is it! Congratulations, Mrs. Shirley Montserrat. You have won for yourself £3,330. By golly, the excitement is just too much for me. Oh, heavens, what are you going to do with all of that money? Gosh, £3,330 for Mrs. S. Montserrat, right here on the Findus Frozen Food segment on a merry old Monday morning, November 21. And I guess that's going to be a date you'll long remember, Shirley, isn't it? Gosh, that's it, £3,330. Now let me see, what could I do with $3,300? Oh, well, I can't bear to think about it. But anyway, congratulations to you, Shirley. And, oh, it's wonderful that you have won all that money. Gosh, wowee, that does it. And once again, let's extend congratulations to Mrs. Shirley Montserrat of Ruskin, Albion Crescent, Chalfont St. Giles in Bucks. And, of course, we'll be telling you tomorrow, which is Tuesday, all about our next contest, which will be Caroline Cash Casino Contest number 3. And we'll give you the initial clues for this third contest. And we hope, well, we extend our wishes that you win, because this is strictly a game that is dependent entirely upon the luck of the draw. Gosh, I'm going to have to sit back for a spell and just sort of sweat this one out, because I'm so excited about it all. So once again, congratulations, Shirley, and you have won yourself £3,330. Yes, play Caroline Cash Casino 5 times a day, Monday through Saturday, with the makers of these quality products: Findus Frozen Foods, Libby's Products, Weetabix, and Alberto VO5 Shampoo. Join us in the fun with those fantastic prizes to be won. We'll be back in an hour for Libby's Products.
But Cash Casino was only one of 6, 7, 8 promotions that were running at any moment in time.
What's your line? Do you sell or for that matter, whatever you... Radio Caroline can sell it for you. Caroline can advertise everything from to, or even, if that's the sort of business you're in, let Caroline do the selling for you. Millions of people listen to Caroline every day. Send them your message. Contact Caroline Sales. Give them a... on Hyde Park 9721 or... at 6 Chesterfield Gardens, London, West 1. But a word of warning, if you're selling... there's nothing we can do for you.
Caroline, son of the nation. Caroline, son of the land. Caroline, son of the nation. Caroline.
Things went fairly smoothly for both the Radio Caroline ships until the evening of the 20th of January 1966, when Caroline South, the MV Mi Amigo, broke away from its moorings. Radio Caroline's shipping agent, Bill Scadden, played an important part in the rescue operation. He explains what happened.
The Coast Guard rang me up at about 8:20 to say they'd been taking some bearings on the Caroline, and they were convinced that she was drifting. I took my car onto the greensward at Brinton and tried flashing them with my headlights unsuccessfully. I happened to know that the crew mainly looked at ITV, so I phoned ITV and said, could they flash something on the screen addressed to the ship Mi Amigo to tell them they were drifting. and at 9:20 they did so. And that was the first the ship knew she was drifting, by which time she was opposite the golf club here. And she had rather low-powered diesels. The temperature was nearly freezing, and the diesels were started by compressed air. It was then found that the bottles of compressed air were nearly empty. They couldn't start the diesels. They eventually did with the aid of a torch and all the rest of it, by which time she was almost on the beach. By the grace of God, she came in between two breakwaters, the only one of many between Frinton and Holland-on-Sea, where there was one had been taken out for some nautical purpose. And the result is she didn't crash into a concrete breakwater, but came up onto the beach, which was soft sand. She was nearly flat-bottomed. They had a big Dutch tug come over. The tide was coming in and lapping round the ship. Another half an hour and she was in about 3 feet of water. They started the main engines just at the right moment by luck. And up in the air went 2 or 3 tons of sand from the propellers, and she waddled, thought she was going over once, and I don't know whether it was God or what, but she slid down the beach into deeper water. I was standing watching her with Roland O'Reilly. He flung his arms round my neck and he said, "What a wonderful sight, Mr. Scuttle."
Caroline, sound of the nation.
A desperate race against time and tide to save the stranded pop pirate ship Radio Caroline was going on off Frinton, Essex today. There were fears that the 480-ton ship, swept ashore by gales, would break up or be flung against the sea wall. A tug and tender were standing by at Harwich, and another was reported on its way from Holland to help refloat the ship.
Although Radio Caroline's ship was back on the air, the hull had been badly damaged and repairs were necessary. The ship had to be towed to Holland, so Radio Caroline South was off the air. Mrs. Britt Wagner, the owner of a Swedish station, Radio Syd, came to the rescue. She offered Ronan O'Reilly the use of the ship, the Cheetah II. Ronan accepted, and on the 31st of January 1966, the new ship arrived at a position off Frinton. Within a few weeks, Radio Caroline was back on the air.
Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline. C-A-R-O-L-I-N-E. Caroline, Caroline, Caroline.
It was not until the 5th of April 1966 that the Mi Amigo returned. It had been completely overhauled and fitted with a new 50,000-watt transmitter on 259 meters. Programs started 2 weeks later, and for a few days were relayed from both radio ships.
Before I get underway with the action show, let me tell you that Radio Caroline now has action on a new wavelength, and that's on the Mi Amigo. They're doing 10 test transmissions, I beg your pardon, on 259 meters on the medium wave right now. So, although it saddens me to have you leave me on 199, why don't you switch over the dial and listen to the station of the nation?
Newsbeat, presenting Caroline headline news and weather.
Radio Caroline was now on full power and had the largest offshore radio audience, 8.8 million listeners. But there were now 10 offshore stations broadcasting from ships and marine structures outside British territorial waters. The British government reacted by introducing to Parliament the Marine Etc. Broadcasting Offences Bill. It made it illegal for British citizens to work for, supply or advertise on a pirate station. The future of Caroline seemed uncertain.
Is your name Michael A. Hearn?
Micah Hearn. Yeah, Micah Hearn. Yeah, that's right, yeah,
Splendid,
yeah.
splendid.
Yeah, yeah.
You sometimes refer to yourself as your DJ Michael A., I understand.
Well, sometimes, yes.
Excellent, yes.
I do, yeah,
Well, I've got a warrant here for your arrest, sir.
You got a what?
I have reason to believe that on April the 1st last, and on several occasions prior to that, you broadcast a program called the Mike Hearn Show from Radio Caroline. By so doing, you are guilty of an offence under the Marine and Broadcasting Offences Bill. I must therefore ask you to accompany me to the station, sir.
No, really, you must be joking. Come on, you must be, really.
You, British subject, sir?
British? Yes, I'm British, yeah, British through and through, land of open glory. I love Britain, really, sender victorious, happy and glorious.
That does it, sir. I'm afraid you'll have to come with me.
The government's Marine Offences Bill has now had its final reading. A basic freedom is at stake. The freedom of a British subject to work where he wants to.
Caroline decided it would continue to operate after the bill became law. Arrangements were made to transfer the offices to Holland.
Something that isn't understood by a lot of people, but the European Broadcasting Union puts out a chart of stations that are legit and illegit as they see it. Not legal and illegal, but legit and illegit. In other words, operating within the Copenhagen Plan and outside the Copenhagen Plan. And in fact, I think there's something like 580 or something stations in the European EBU operation. And of that, over 300 of them are in the illegit section. So we are in the illegit section, obviously. In other words, not complying to the 48 Copenhagen Plan. But of course we weren't there in 48, right, to agree to the wavelength. So we weren't, obviously we can't be in breach of it. Now, on the other hand, there are many stations, countries, delegations who were there at the 1948 plan and are in breach. So that on that basis, Caroline is as legitimate as about 300 other stations, and in fact even more legitimate than the great majority of those, because they are of countries that did attend the Copenhagen Conference and then went back and broke it. So I would think that on a legit basis, on a legit, illegit basis, we are more legit than a majority of the stations that are operating outside the Copenhagen Plan, which agreed wavelengths.
Come in. Yes?
Here, are you the one who's working on the Pirates Bill?
Well, yes, I've got something to do with it, I have, yes.
Well, I've got a proposition for you, my boy.
Go on.
Don't wait for this bill to go through, it might miss. Now, you know how the boats are on the outside of the 3-mile limit?
Yes, we can't touch them out there, I know.
Well, I propose to bring them within to 2 miles of the coast.
And then we could nab them. Go on.
Well, most of the pirates are on the east coast, using my machines and equipment at very reasonable prices. We will set up outboard motors along the west coast and shift England and Scotland 1 mile to the east. Thus, the pirates will be within the 3-mile limit already.
And then we can prosecute them. Hello, Harold.
The 14th of August 1967 became the deadline date for the offshore stations, and some DJs decided to leave.
It's going to be good to see the old sights of Liverpool Street Station tonight at 5:45, I'll tell you that. I've been out here 2 weeks, 13 months, and this is 2 weeks of doing 2 shows a day. So, if you're in the neighborhood, why don't you drop down to Liverpool Street Station tonight about 5:45. I'll be there. Some of us, of course, are leaving for the very last time, and it usually happens, as soon as Edwards wants to go off on shore leave, the weather is going to blow up. And we've got a force 8 gale out here, something like that at the moment, and it's blowing up even worse. I pity the lads who've got to stay out here, really. 20.5 minutes now before the hour of 1 o'clock, right here on the Telly Tom Edwards Lunchtime Show. Just had a look outside, in actual fact, and our tender has just drawn alongside the good ship Caroline with a great big kapow, and the Admiral, Robbie Dale, and Sir Johnny Walker are on it, looking little bit seasick at the moment, and there are about 2 million newspaper reporters out there, I think.
Roger Day takes up the story.
So I came off on that last tender, and that was something I'm glad I didn't miss. I'd have liked to have been on the ship when it went illegal, but it was good to see all the people at Liverpool Street, because our train got in, the train before the Radio London train got in. Liverpool Street was a mass of faces. I don't know how many people it takes to fill it up, but it was full. And we got police escort to a taxi, and that is great.
All the other stations closed down, and again Caroline was alone. All advertising had to come from abroad, and the ship would have to be tendered from the continent.
This is Caroline South on 259 meters in the medium wave band, the continuing sound of free radio. And
your future in commercial radio.
And tonight, at 6 o'clock, you can hear the Admiral himself, Robbie Dale, on the airwaves, and at 9 it's Johnny Walker time, and at 12 midnight, well, just about everybody will be listening. We hope you won't be one who misses out. And that listening time, 12 midnight on 259.
Now, tonight I'm feeling a little bit nervous. I've got to admit it, I really am feeling a wee bit nervous, because all of a sudden, around about 3:05 this afternoon, it hit me like a ton of bricks, or like 15 million people. And I just realized, I thought, well, oddly enough, we appear to have doubled our audience this afternoon, because we are now the one and only. And a long time ago, that's the way the situation was. That's the way the situation was. So, I mean, I'm nervous. I'm stumbling over words already. But I'd like to say welcome. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Caroline. And we'll try and love you just that little bit more.
8 minutes now before 11 o'clock. Come on now, where are we?
Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation.
With one free voice, they said.
As the midnight hour approached, the disc jockeys on board the Caroline South ship, Johnny Walker, Robbie Dale and Ross Brown, feeling alone and nervous, prepared for one of the greatest moments in offshore radio's history. Then at midnight, the station changed its name and officially became Radio Caroline International.
This is your radio station. This is Radio Caroline. It is now 12 midnight. We want to say welcome to the new phase of broadcasting from Caroline. I want you to remember something. That is a station that belongs to you and is right. Cannot ever be taken away from you. And there are a lot of people along the coast tonight who are flashing their headlamps at us. Very, very nice to see you. You've made us more happy, and I couldn't think it was possible, but you have made us more happy than we are already. Dale, what are you doing there?
I'm looking out the porthole window. It really is amazing to see all those cars out there, and to know that we're not alone in this most important moment. It's tremendous.
Of course we're not alone, you
I've just been outside, and all the lights are flashing across the water, and it really is a tremendous sight to see. It really is.
Let's say a couple of thank yous now. Robbie and myself would like to thank our leader, Mr. Ronan O'Reilly, and Mr. Philip Solomon, all who've worked for Radio Caroline to make it possible for us to sit here and speak to you now. Also to thank the many, many people who have been with Caroline since that Easter Sunday, way back in 1964. And we are still here because you have given us such tremendous support. And we want to say thank you. And we know, naturally enough, we're going to have your support for a long, long time to come.
Radio Caroline now had an audience of 20 million, the largest commercial station in the world, a figure that has never been surpassed.
This is Radio Caroline International, the home of the British Music Explosion.
The Marine Fences Bill applied to Caroline South on the 15th of August. It didn't apply to us until the end of August. So we were virtually, everybody was saying that we were free for 2 weeks longer. We even came off and we played a game of football with St. Helens GPO team. This is after the Marine Fences Bill had been signed. Then after the end of August, we, of course, had to, instead of taking the 40-minute trip from the boat to Ramsey, we had to take our 18-hour, at the best of times, trip to Dundalk in Southern Ireland. And at the worst, it would take something like 3 days.
Caroline International, the station with the happy difference.
They flew me out to Amsterdam, and I went out on that awful tender ride from Malden to Harwich. It was terrible. It used to take 16 hours in good conditions and 23 and 24 hours in bad conditions.
The station that's all heart. The station with the happy difference. And we love you. Caroline International. Play sing-along hit.
10-9-8-7-6-5-4-3-2.
1-1-1-1. What's happening, pussycat? We present the Admiral Robbie Dale. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere. That's good.
It's Sunday on Radio Caroline International, and for the next 3 hours we present the American Hot 100 Show.
Let's go, Griffin!
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
This is the Roger Day Show.
25 minutes now away from the hour of 4 o'clock. Must confess, didn't feel very good when I came on the air this afternoon. Not sort of, ill physically or that, but just sort of down low, no mail or anything. There's no tender, and I thought, I must try and cheer up. But it's funny, as soon as I get on the 259 Smile on Your Dial radio, bang, powie, and crunch, all that kind of thing. I'm all live and go. Just to remind you who's sitting in for Stevie Mac on a Tuesday.
It's Roger Day on the go-go!
Am I really? Oh, come on.
I always listening to Roger Day in the morning. I put something in the oven for 10 minutes and relax to the sounds of the Roger Day Show.
He's a go-go! The Goon Maldoon on 259.
I remember when I first got on the ship, I met Robbie Dale, you know, and by this time the station was quite big time. And Robbie sort of met me on the gangplank and just sort of said, well, who sent you, and, you know, what station have you been with? And I said, well, nothing, you know, I've just done discotheques. And he went, oh, go to bed. I'll call you later. And then at 12 o'clock he did call me, and I did 12 till 6 for about a month.
This is Caroline International on 259, Great Britain's only pre-commercial radio station.
Also, actually getting out to the ship, I did expect a big ocean liner. I really didn't expect this sort of, what rather, Mickey Mouse little ship. I sort of dreamt up this big sort of white ocean-going vessel and all plush stuff, and when we in fact went out on the tender, it was only it was the Offshore One, I think. And it sort of, I was a bit disillusioned at the time, but the station still sounded good. I thought we were still going to get out to a monster ship, and we got along to the ship that really wasn't much bigger than the tender, and it got awful rough. It must have been about a 4.6 or something. And it just had to go out. There was no more tenders that day, and we just had to get on board. And this big Dutchman said, "You've got to jump now." You know, there was no question of not jumping. We just had to leap across to the other ship.
Music. And don't forget, if you want a menu read out between 15 after 1 and 20 after 1, write to Maldoon's Matt Menus, Radio Caroline International, Amsterdam and blah blah, Amsterdam, Holland, okay? But if you want to write to me and say how lovely I am, I don't mind. You don't have to write a menu or write a request. Just write and say how lovely Spangles is.
Going back in time on the sounds of the nation, it's the Caroline Flashback.
Music.
Bulletin, 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 bulletin.
Andy Archer takes up the story.
Well, I think the funniest experience that ever happened to me was back in 1967. We'd been having a purge on calling each other by female names, and consequently Johnny Walker became Joanna Walker, and Stevie Merrick became Marjorie Merrick, and Roger Day became Rachel Day, etc., etc. It was just pure fun. And one day I was reading the news at 5 o'clock, and Roger Day said over the air, "It's now 5 o'clock and time to join Ada Camp for the news." And I read out the headlines, not realizing what he had said. And just as I was starting on the main story, it hit me, and I just burst out laughing and fell on the floor. Well, I must have been on the floor for about a minute laughing, and anyway, I pulled myself to my seat to look next door, and Roger wasn't there. And I stood up, and he was down on the floor in a ball, rolling with laughter, which started me off again. And it was about 5:05 before any sanity came back to the air.
This has been Caroline Newsbeat.
Early on the 3rd of March, 1968, the tug Utrecht pulled alongside Caroline North.
We heard this bang on the side of the ship, a gentle bang on the side of the ship. And of course, you know, being very curious, at that time of the morning, especially where we were situated, we wanted to know what it was. Before we could even get up to go outside to see what it was all about, these great big, huge, powerful Charles Atlas type of Dutchmen came on board. Well, one of these men immediately went up to the captain's cabin. The others came into the mess room and started speaking in Dutch, which we couldn't understand what was going on. The Dutch crewmen later told us that we had been boarded by representatives of the Weissmuller Company. Not to worry about anything, nobody was going to be harmed, blah, 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 you know, the usual spiel about everything's going to be all right. So myself, the chief engineer and the captain and the chief representative of this boarding party, we had a little get-together up in the captain's cabin. We were told by the Weissmuller man that we weren't going on the air next morning, that we were being towed away to Holland for our own safety because the ship hadn't been docked and checked for a few years. The chief engineer was told to hand the crystals in to ensure that we couldn't broadcast. And we objected strongly. We were told simply that the ship was going to Holland, and that was that. And unbeknown to us, our brothers, or our sister ship down in the south, was boarded that same morning.
Roger Day takes up the story.
I was just going on the air about 5 o'clock, and I never got on the air, as you know. It's just tape music, sort of warming up the transmitter. Everyone's crying their eyes out. It's ridiculous. Grown men, and we're sort of weeping, and not nice. Because I think, despite what they said, we could see it was the end.
The MV Caroline and the MV Mi Amigo were illegally towed to Amsterdam and impounded.
Well, in fact, what happened was there was a row between the Weissmuller brothers internally, of which we were totally unaware. And because one of the brothers was involved with us as an investor, as it were, the other brother, his older brother, got very uptight at that. This was a row they were having, personal row. And one of the games was, all right, I'll take your ships away, to the other brother. The other brother, thinking that was a complete bluff, didn't pass it on to me or anyone else. And Zap, I mean, literally sent out the tugboats. Their crews were on there anyway, so there wasn't any sort of pirate grab situation in a way, although technically they were committing piracy. But it was absolutely to do with a row between the brothers, unless somebody got to the older brother, right, and said, Zap, there's X amount, get rid of those ships. Now that is not, you know, we all know there are setups that do play those kind of games.
It seemed that an era of free radio, pioneered by Caroline, had ended.
The loss of Caroline was much bigger to me than I ever realized. I mean, you know, than I ever thought was possible. You know, after that March '68, and it went, you know, it was just taken away. I mean, I thought it was so unjust. I mean, anyway, right, that you could, you know, having built something up that had an audience of 20 million from nothing, you know, you get a couple of old hawks of shit, and suddenly out there, and suddenly there's like, you know, 20 million people at the other end getting, you know, enjoying something, getting a buzz in a dull, you know, fairly dull lives, or, you know, lives that are not full of that much excitement. Suddenly there's a bit of pleasure for them in this situation. It had a very big impact. It had really hit me very hard. I was really very depressed. It's really extraordinary, because I wouldn't have, you know, I would have said, yes, I'll miss it tremendously, because it wasn't just a business to me, it was a whole kind of concept and way of life.
But even in this century, people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King have shown us that if we strive for freedom, we can all attain it. This is the spirit of Caroline, and in the same way, this spirit can never be stifled. After Caroline closed in 1968, freedom of choice in radio seemed to be a thing of the past, never to return to Britain. However, in 1970, another station, Radio North Sea International, sailed to England and dropped anchor at a position close to where the Caroline ship had been stationed a few years before.
This is the happiest place, Radio North Sea, the happiest place.
It was shortly before the general election, and the Labour government was worried. For the first time in British history, the government ordered the intentional jamming of a radio station. The station made a surprising move by for 2 weeks campaigning under the name of Radio Caroline International.
The searches at that time, and this feeling we feel. 6 minutes before the hour of 9 o'clock, and my goodness me, what a fun day this is going to be from Radio Caroline International.
The day after the general election, the station changed its name back to Radio North Sea. However, there is no doubt that Radio Caroline's broadcast influenced the result of the election. It was the first general election in which 18-year-olds were able to vote, and a substantial number of them used their vote to support freedom of choice. Meanwhile, the two radio ships lay in harbour in Amsterdam. On the 29th of May 1972, the two radio ships were put up for auction. Sadly, the MV Caroline was sold for scrap and broken up. The MV Mi Amigo was also sold but saved from the scrap yard. A Dutch radio enthusiast bought the boat, claiming he was going to turn it into a pirate radio museum.
One of the sort of people to start to play a part at the very beginning, a sort of a Dutch free radio freak, as it were, called Gerard van Dam. Gerard was an enthusiastic, had been enthusiastic Dutch free radio man over the years in relation to Caroline, and played a big part in that whole saga. I mean, played a part in the actual getting young guys who are free radio freaks to help wash the thing out and clean it up and things like that. But the pros who came at that time, in fact, I would say the biggest influence was in fact Peter Chicago. Had Peter Chicago not come to Caroline at that time, I'm 100% certain, virtually, that it would not be there today. And another person to play a large part, who would come second to Chicago, in fact, would be Chris Carey. Because in that era, there was nobody around who was willing to plonk money on the table. So those people really were dedicated, to the idea. It wasn't a bunch of businessmen sitting around saying, right, there's the money, do the job. There are people who are really dedicated to really regenerating the energy of Caroline of the 60s in the 70s, which is an exciting idea. I mean, if to do that, to achieve that, is 1,000 times more difficult to get any kind of energy going. When you think of what Caroline was in the 60s, I mean, it was like, it's almost like recreating the Beatles.
At the beginning of September, the Mi Amigo slipped out of Zaandam harbour at dawn. Later the same day, it dropped anchor in international waters 4 miles from the Dutch seaside resort of Scheveningen. Within a few weeks, test transmissions started under the name of Radio 199.
Test transmission from Radio 199. If you just tuned our way, good evening to you and welcome to this test transmission. Our programmes proper start tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock with non-stop music. At 7 o'clock it's me, Andy Archer, with you till 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock it's Leon Kaiser.
But it was nearly 3 months before the ship was refitted and full programmes could begin. Crispian St. John remembers.
I remember when the Mi Amigo first went back to sea. It was after a heck of a long time lying around the harbour, and it was doing nothing at all but, I suppose, deteriorating. The conditions were pretty rough, to say the least. There was a load of water in the transmitter hold. It was in the cabins. We had no electric power at all, and there was a lot of equipment missing from all sides of the ship. However, it seemed from the moment that the ship got back to sea, work went on to improve everything. That was from the living conditions to the working unit as a broadcast station. And the first broadcast we made from the Mi Amigo, that was the same day, if I remember rightly, as Radio Veronica changed frequency. They went from 192 metres up to 538 metres, and that was in an attempt to improve nighttime reception for them in Holland. And Radio North Sea, too, began its short-lived transmissions on the old frequency of 192 metres there, and in fact half an hour or less after Veronica moved away. It was also BBC Radio 1's birthday. The Mi Amigo transmissions were made on that day consisted of simply non-stop music, and there were no announcements whatsoever. I remember we did slip in 1 or 2 records, such as the B-side of Caroline by the Fortunes, which I think gave things away, because we were not allowed under any conditions to mention that we were Radio Caroline at that time. It was going to be a big surprise. However, I think many thousands of people guessed, and we had hundreds of reception reports from over Europe for that one day's broadcasting. Anyway, that was followed by a long silence, which allowed engineers to work on transmitters and studios to get them into proper working order. And the next time we went on the air, it was as a new station, Radio 199, which was meant to be a regional radio station aimed at The Hague and the western parts of Holland. And that, of course, was on 199 metres, the original Caroline frequency of the 60s. 199 broadcast a mixture of programming in both Dutch and English. And we had advertising found to us by a local advertising agency who went round selling airtime to local businessmen. And they would say, listen, if you want to hear your commercials on Caroline, tell us what you want to hear. And they would tell us, give us the details. We would phone the office, or the advertising agent would phone the office, and the details could be broadcast. The commercial could be broadcast within literally minutes on the station. That's how fast things worked in those days. I think 199 was most successful in its own way, especially as it pioneered a new kind of format of mixing English and Dutch programming. And that was rather than splitting them up into, say, Dutch during the daytime and English at night, which was the sort of tradition at that time. However, looking back, of course, the aim of the organisation was to bring Radio Caroline back on the air. And because of that, work continued yet again throughout the day and night towards that end.
Just before Christmas, the first official broadcast of Radio Caroline was made.
Serving the European continent from the North Sea, this is the new Radio Caroline.
Central European time is now exactly 10 o'clock. In Great Britain, the time is 9 o'clock. You're listening to Radio Caroline on 199, the sound of the nation.
Here's an all-American big hit, ready to rock it. Radio Caroline.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the next 2 hours.
Unfortunately, the station was only on the air for a few days before it ran into trouble. Andy Archer explains.
One night, Captain Vanderkamp and the crew came out, all the crew that were owed money, and took over the ship. We were pretty helpless, really, because they came on board with revolvers and things. And once they got on board, they threw their revolvers and guns into the sea, and just carried lumps of iron and pieces of wood. And we just sat there and were towed into the harbour of Amsterdam.
Chris Carey takes up the story.
It was very freaky how we got out. I mean, we were only in the harbour about 3 or 4 days, and we went out really without too many problems. It was against all odds, but we just did all the right things at the right time and pleased enough people at the right time, and suddenly we just sailed out.
The MV Mi Amigo returned to sea on the 2nd of January 1973, and just after 3 p.m., the station was back on the air.
Sound of the nation, Radio Caroline.
There were now Dutch programs during the day and English shows throughout the night.
Als u nu pas ingeschakeld hebt op Radio Caroline, dan wens ik u allemaal...
Sound of the nation, Radio Caroline.
This is Caroline on 259, and the Steve England Going Back in Time show, which will be going through until 9 o'clock, and then it's Robin Adcroft.
Sound of the nation, Radio Caroline.
And that's about it from me for tonight, and I'll see you perhaps back at 6 o'clock. If you'd like to write to the station or to any of the disc jockeys out here or the Caroline Club, it's Radio Caroline, Postbox 2448, The Hague in Holland. That's Radio Caroline, Postbox 2448, The Hague in Holland.
And now for the next 3 hours, the Norman Barrington Smythe program.
An album station was a reality. I mean, that was something I believed very strongly, that an album station for the 70s was something that would really have tremendous impact, where, because suddenly you had an era where all of these artists were putting more effort and energy into their albums than they were into the singles. That the whole emphasis was onto albums, and yet there was no station just playing album music.
Music's right here in your ear. It's Bob Noakes, he's very near on Caroline at 259 radio. That's really fine.
I was given a radio set to Mem one day, and I tuned it into a station that was playing continuous music. Quite nice. And I heard a voice say, "This is Radio Caroline." I thought, good grief, they went off the air years ago. This must be a joke. So I kept on listening, and somebody said, "Oh, we're looking for a transmitter engineer and a cook, and this is the address." I thought, well, that's fascinating. And then the woman who lived above me gave me a piece of paper with the address and said she'd heard the same thing, and I was an engineer, why didn't I write to them? So I did, and 2 or 3 days later I was on the ship. I was supposed to go out as a transmitter engineer. In fact, I hadn't worked with transmitters for a long, long time, and I never worked with transmitters of that sort of size. So it was a bit of a blag, but Chris asked me to come over, so I flew over and met him and said, come out and see the ship tomorrow, and there was no question of you going back on land. I went out to the ship, and I was just expected to stay, and I did stay, and Didn't do much transmitter engineering for the first few days because we weren't often on the air, but did all kinds of other things as well and got into the swing of it. One night I'd been working very hard and I went to bed I suppose about 9 in the morning and slept till about 6 or something. And when I got up, Andy Archer said to me, "Oh, Bob, surprise for you today." I said, "Oh yes, what's that?" He said, "You're doing a program tonight." I said, "What? I'm doing a program?" Can't believe it. And they'd been promoting it on the air for about the previous 3 or 4 hours. The Noakes Radio Spectacular comes to the air this morning at 4, and everybody was expecting it to be an incredible laugh because I'd never done a program before. I never made I never intended to go on the air, never wanted to go on the air, and they thought it would just be a big laugh. And I went on and did a program which, was reasonably successful, and I think Ronan liked it and asked me to do some more. So I did. I found it a bit difficult towards the end because doing the engineering side and doing programs too regularly can be a bit of a stretch. But it was fun, something I hadn't done before. I enjoyed it.
Transmissions continued, although there were some problems with both the transmitters and the generators. Offices and studios opened in The Hague to handle advertising and programming.
Sound of Nation, Radio Caroline!
On Monday the 2nd of April 1973, a hurricane-force storm swept Holland, killing 1 person and injuring many others. In the North Sea, radio ships took a beating. Radio Caroline was able to outride the storm, but the Radio Veronica ship, the Norderney, at the peak of the storm, broke its anchor chain and was washed up onto the beach.
Ja, luisteraars, goedenavond. Hier is nogmaals uw technicus Ruud Doets. Tot onze spijt moeten we onze uitzendingen staken, omdat we te dicht het strand naderen. We gaan zo meteen van boord en alles is hier verder goed. We hopen dat alles goed blijft gaan. We hopen ook dat we weer gauw muziek kunnen verzorgen en blijft ons steunen. En aan alle vrouwen, sterkte.
Chris Carey takes up the story.
One particular night, I went to bed at about 11 o'clock. I was well shattered. I was woken up the next day at about 8 o'clock by Ronan to say, "Tell me about the ships." And he said, "Well, where's North Sea today?" And I said, they're okay. And how's us? And we were on the air also okay. He said, "Well, what about Veronica?" I said, "Well, I haven't listened to Veronica today, but I guess they're okay as well." He said, "Well, go and look on the beach because that's where they are. Go and do a deal with them quick." So we went round to meet Bill Vervey and Lex Harding and some of the other people there. And Ronan also flew over very rapidly because this was a point where we could make a few quid and also show that we weren't just into money, we were into helping people. And we went across and talked to them. We guaranteed that we'd have Veronica coming out on 259 within 3 days. Or I think it was 2 days. We didn't have really much time, and we were already off the air with all sorts of problems like generators and aerials that weren't working properly. And we had to guarantee that we'd put Veronica programs out in 2 days, and all the Veronica personnel who had looked at the Caroline said it was absolutely impossible and that no way could Caroline ever do it. And they wouldn't talk to North Sea because they'd fallen out with them, so it was all down to us or nothing. And I went on board with met Chicago and Dick, who also were very sceptical about the chance of it ever coming on. We worked day and night. I had a terrible cold. Chicago wasn't very well. He'd already hurt his hands by taking a heat exchanger out of some contraption in the engine room, and it ripped all his hands in two and was all bandaged up. And with a lot of effort and energy, mainly with Chicago and Dick Palmer, we finally got Veronica to come on the air. And we were supposed to be on, I think, at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we were 1 minute late, and people were pacing up and down in the shipping agent's office on Scheveningen Harbour, and they were all saying, "No way will it come on, you're all wasting your time," and it's all a big mock. And at 1 minute past 11 o'clock, on came the Veronica jingles, and Veronica successfully broadcasted from the Caroline ship for about 10 days.
Radio Veronica, het station voor de mensen van morgen.
At this time, Caroline got a new aerial, 186 feet high. Chris Carey continues.
Caroline Aerial was basically built at night, under cover, under the most amazing conditions ever. The biggest thing on Caroline was when the Aerial fell down, was to build a new one. And Dick Palmer, who had lots of experience at building aerials, I had no problems in chasing him up there to do all sorts of things that I wouldn't dare do. But he could do things, and he finally gave up almost on the last section and said, "This is suicide. I'm not going to go up there. There's nothing holding me up there." And you climb up there and look at the ship down below you, and it looks like a postage stamp, and there's just nothing holding me up there. And Norman and Robin at the time were sort of quite worried about their positions, and I think they were generally interested in Caroline and what it was doing. And they volunteered to put the last two sections up, which everybody else had said was impossible. And they went up there and they did it, and they managed to get all the guy wires on, and they fixed it up. And I mean, it was 200 feet high, and for a bank teller and an audio engineer, it was quite some going.
It's really freaky because, you see, at the top of the mast, though the ship was pretty still at the bottom, it only probably moved a few inches from side to side because the weather was very good while we were doing the work. But at the top, of course, the wind was quite heavy, and we were moving about probably 4 or 5 feet from side to side. So working up there is far more difficult than working on the deck, and you haven't got very much space to work around in as well. And you've got to use both hands, and you know, after being up there for a couple of hours, the soles of your feet begin to ache like mad because you've only got a small area to stand on. It's very difficult to describe how freaky it is, especially if you haven't done that kind of work before.
We used to pay £100, which really isn't very much for a person's life, to climb an aerial, to do things that, I mean, most of them, I remember one day Yarp had finally put the last wire on it, and he came down right down to the bottom, which took in those days something like about 15 minutes to climb that mast, came down it and said, "Well, fantastic, it all works." And then I openly told him that I knew nothing about aerials at all. It was all a total fantasy, and I'd drawn it out in the Caroline office house and had gone out to the ship and said, "Here we go." And they were under the impression that I was an aerial designer and had built hundreds of the damn things. And, you know, one or two people, like 4 people in fact, got £100 for risking their lives. And I went through some terrible moments thinking what I was going to tell these people's families, that if they'd actually fallen off and killed themselves, which was absolutely inevitable if the aerial had collapsed or anything had gone wrong with my theory, that they would have crashed into the sea or into the ship and just killed themselves. Whatever was I going to tell their people if they'd killed themselves just for a mere £100? And I think Robin and Norman, who put the last 2 pieces on the mast, got £50 each because the money was running a bit low there. And they never even said, "Don't worry," but they just said, "Thank you, that's okay, 50 quid's okay, we're down on the ground, it's up, it's finished." Great team spirit.
Radio Caroline.
On the 13th of May 1973, test transmissions began on a new wavelength of 389 meters with a power of 10,000 watts.
You are listening to a test transmission from Radio Caroline International in the medium wave on 389 meters, which is 773 kilohertz. Reception reports, please, to Radio Caroline International, Caroline House, The Hague, in Holland.
By the end of the month, Radio Caroline was broadcasting on 2 different wavelengths simultaneously.
Blood, Sweat and Tears from their greatest hits album, and that was a Laura Nyro song called And When I Die. This is Caroline coming to you from the Amsterdam studios, and something that always amazes me, it makes me laugh, although I shouldn't really do it. We've got a very low door here, and when the customers come into the shop, they're always banging their heads on them, which is I think we should have a sign up there.
Bij ons in de Caroline Countdown of Sound. Nou, je kan het papiertje zo dadelijk niet vinden waar het allemaal op staat. Ik zal het u straks nog wel weten te vertellen. Ciao Cocker was dat, genoteerd in onze Countdown of Sound. En dat heette Pardon Me Sound.
At the beginning of June, a new all-day English service of Radio Caroline started on 389 meters.
And this is Paul Alexander, so nice to be here on the first ever regular program from Radio Caroline International in 1970.
Meanwhile, on the other channel, programs were broadcast in Dutch.
Stuur briefje naar Radio Caroline, Caroline House, Den Haag in Nederland.
Ronan said, "Look, I don't think it's possible to get 2 stations out of one ship. It's only been done by Radio England. They spent absolutely fortunes doing it and never really got it together. I'll go to £100. If you can't do it for £100, forget about it." So we bought about £60 worth of copper wire, and we bought some few insulators which weren't very suitable, and we almost ended up with a toilet which was full of porcelain on the back mast to use as an insulator. And finally we ended up with some German insulators, which were about £3 each, which finally did the job. And for about 5 weeks, generator permitting, we had 2 stations going out without any interreaction at all.
In July, a new sound was heard on 259 meters.
Radio Atlantis, set them up.
A Belgian businessman, Adriaan van Lanschot, joined Caroline to run a daytime service for Belgium and Holland.
Radio Atlantis, Radio Atlantis, goede radio. Radio Atlantis, Radio Atlantis, Radio Agogo. Radio Atlantis, Radio Atlantis, is er weer en blijft. Radio Atlantis, Radio Atlantis, goede radio.
De tijd op Radio Atlantis is nu 6 uur. Wij wensen u een bijzonder goedemorgen en u gaat luisteren naar een uur non-stop muziek met...
In the evenings, another station took to the air, Radio Seagull.
This is Radio Seagull on 259 meters, and at 11 o'clock tonight Mike Hagler comes along, followed at 1 o'clock by Classics with Bob Noakes, and then from 3 till 6 it's Mickey Mercer's music.
Andy Archer explains why the station changed its name to Radio Seagull.
Basically because several listeners had complained that Caroline wasn't really Caroline when it was playing heavy album tracks. So we decided to call it Radio Geronimo, being as Barry Everett and Hugh Nolan were joining us. Then we had a meeting in London and decided that it would probably be more appropriate to call it Radio Seagull, from the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Radio Seagull was quite a unique experience, really, because it was doing what Radio Geronimo was doing a few years previously, but doing it for much longer periods, from 9 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning. And we had quite a good team on board. There was Barry Everett and Hugh Nolan, also Mickey Mercer, and later on, of course, Mike Hagler joined us, and Johnny Jason and Tony Allen, and we had quite a lot of fun on board. I think Radio Seagull was a good station in as much as we were playing not only rock music but also jazz and classical music as well.
At 1:41 p.m. on October the 1st, the new 186-foot mast collapsed into the sea. Only a 26-foot section remained. A makeshift aerial was erected and the station continued with low power. The crew of the ship and the disc jockeys, working together, managed against all odds to build a new aerial mast almost 200 feet high and have it completed by Christmas. On New Year's Day, the station went back on the air, not as Radio Atlantis, but as...
Radio Mi Amigo!
The station, which took its name from the ship, was run by another Belgian businessman.
Mi Amigo Radio. Mi Amigo, here we go. Mi Amigo Radio. Mi Amigo, here we go. Go, go! This is the Raffles, this is the Raffles. This is the Raffles, this is the Raffles. Mi Amigo, good vibrations, where the action is. Mi Amigo, much more music, where the action is.
Mi Amigo's lieveling.
Dit is het geluid van Radio Mi Amigo Internationaal. 259 meter in de middengolf. Good morning, this is Radio Mi Amigo International, broadcasting on 259 meters in the medium wave band.
Mi amigo, mi amigo, mi amigo, mi amigo.
A few days after the opening of Radio Mi Amigo, Radio Seagull returned to the air, broadcasting from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. By the beginning of February, the station was on full power of 50,000 watts. Later that month, the station became known as Radio Caroline once again.
Radio Caroline.
Night waves roll, radio Caroline at 259, medium wave to blow your mind, Caroline. Night waves roll, 259 for your soul.
Radio Caroline.
I think that Stonehenge, the Stonehenge Festival, was one of the most important things that Caroline arranged during 1974, and credit really must go to Mike Hagler and Norman Barrington, who originally decided to hold the festival, and then after a lot of discussions for and against the festival, it was decided that it should go on. And I must say I'm very pleased that it did go on, because I think it was quite an event. We met several people down there, such as the Yogi Surya Premananda, who was to become a good friend of Caroline, and also Howard Phillips as well, who came out to the ship on one occasion to sing his songs. I think when we were arriving we were probably expecting to find 50 or 60,000 people, but we weren't disappointed when we saw that only 3,000 people had turned up, because they were 3,000 genuine people, and we spent 2 or 3 days really living together and having a good time, which was what the festival was all about. And I think a good time was had by everybody.
Music's right here in your ear, and the Archer's very near on Caroline at 259 radio. That's really fine.
Give us a bang when you're ready.
Most of the signal sources equipment were new, like we had new microphones, new grams. They weren't particularly good ones because we were limited with our money, but we had new ones. The mixer, very well made mixer, but of course very old, looked a bit tatty, but it worked okay. The inputs of those studios were fed down to limiters, universal audio limiters, weren't they?
Still the best you could buy, but unfortunately valves, and they used to, salt water didn't like them.
Well, they were drenched with salt water. It was amazing they worked. The printed circuits were really badly damaged, foils lifted off here and there, and bits of bridge wire put in, and the wrong valves, because there were peculiar trios that we couldn't get in Holland, and we had to stick in other ones that would get red hot, but it ran okay. Then there was the transmitters, of course, the 10 kilowatt, which was, well, really the mother of all transmitters on that ship, wasn't it, the 10K?
10 kilowatt was a proven transmitter that had worked throughout the USA.
But you could do all kinds of things to it. In fact, we did do all kinds of things to it. It just kept on running. We once had it feeding into a sausage, and the sausage came unhooked and fed into the sea, and the transmitter just kept on charging away, broiling all these fishes all around the ship, but, you know, it kept on the air. Then we had the 50K, which was quite a sight to be seen. It had been very badly vandalised, I suppose that's the word, when it was in harbour. Meters and things had been taken out. And difficult things like delay switches had been taken out. Fellows had come along with maybe a hammer and a pair of wire clippers, clipped off 8 or 9 wires, none of which were numbered, all looking the same, ripped the thing out. You can imagine how long it took to put these back in and get them working properly.
Caroline 259, all the time in your mind. Keep in mind 259, Caroline, music's fine.
Ich bin mein Babykleid here.
Radio Caroline.
But after a really heavy time with the customs people, it left everybody really down and sort of disturbed about the whole afternoon because they'd gone through all the luggage, all the tape recorders. They'd made a big fuss about every single tape had to have an initial stamped on it, which was a bit silly considering we were sending out hundreds of tapes a week and every number had to be different and checked at both ends. And after all of this, Chicago climbed off the tender. He was the last one off, looking as glum as ever, with washing in one hand and the radio telephone in the other, making every attempt to sort of walk off looking smart. Got onto the gangplank, and the gangplank gradually started rocking and moving, and looks of horror appeared on people's faces. And the whole thing tipped totally upside down, with him still clinging to it. The almighty splash, and Chicago was gone. Lots of heads over the side to see Chicago emerged, absolutely perfect condition, just soaking wet, not a tie out of place. But he had lost the radio telephone, and he was gradually brought ashore by a hook. But it did break the ice, everybody started smiling a little bit, and Chicago took it very well, because we thought he was going to scream and rant and rave and go burlesque and join the Mebo. And he didn't. He just came out of it and saw the funny side of it. Nobody would sit with him in the car. And I think he just sat about for about half an hour, and after a while it just became normal and everything dried on him. We just carried on.
I remember that after we got through all the shock of him falling in, we were worried about him at first. Dick freaked and said, "Get a lifebelt, get a lifebelt," and Kate was just standing there laughing her head off, splitting her sides open.
Because it was funny. I mean, it was a shame, because when he had finally immersed out of the ship and the side of the harbour, which was a very dangerous situation, all he came up with was laughter. Yeah. Gradually everybody stopped laughing, he was going to lose his temper, and he didn't. And he came up, in fact, laughing in the end.
But you were very worried about the radio telephone, Chris. So remember, you got two boat hooks and tied them together and poked them down into the dock water, covered in mud and stuff. Said, "Oh, I've got it." You pulled it up and out came this filthy old milk crate with weeds and rubbish hanging off it, and said, "Oh, that's not it."
Oh, what was even sillier was the fact that I'd finally given up that it was too deep, went away, commissioned a diver who said, "I'll go at 8 o'clock. Now, he knew all about that harbour, and at 8 o'clock it was 4 feet deep, climbed down the stairs, charged me 20 quid and picked it out of the mud.
Loving good music, Radio Caroline. You just need no more. On 259.
During the summer, the Dutch government introduced legislation against offshore radio, similar to that which the British government had introduced in 1967. The law came into force on the 1st of September. There were 3 other radio ships located off the Dutch coastline. Like their English counterparts 7 years before, they all decided to close down on the day before the law came into force.
Radio Atlantic.
Radio Veronica. Fun-loving Orient Eye, the music machine.
During the afternoon of the 29th of August, the MV Mi Amigo weighed anchor and, assisted by a Dutch tug, set sail for England. She continued to broadcast throughout her journey, but no mention of Caroline's move was made over the airwaves. On the afternoon of August the 30th, 1974, the MV Mi Amigo dropped anchor at a new position, about 18 miles off the Essex coast. The First Lady of Radio had come home.
Loving awareness is free, is free, is free.
The LA consciousness thing, which, you know, I've spent about 7 years literally getting, you know, working that one out. You know, I've been through everything from Scientology to the Maharishi Yogi. I mean, I've gone into all those different different sort of head trips, and the LA thing was was something that has to do with transmitting. It has to do with computers. It has to do with the whole consciousness of what the brain is, and that it is a creature of habit, basically, and that if you develop any habit, you know, the habit becomes a fact. You know, that at a certain point, it's effort initially. I mean, to be LA is effort, and people think, "Oh, I couldn't possibly do it." But the moment that the effort, is over, it's like I've just started doing yoga, and after a while it becomes easier and easier, because you get into the habit of doing things, exercising things that you couldn't possibly. Once you get into the habit, that becomes a reality. And that's what we find with the LA thing, that once, I remember the first time I said to the jocks, would you do it? And they said it's totally unprofessional, I wouldn't mention love on the air. No way, wouldn't have anything to do with it, right? Now my own influence came from Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who, King got it from Gandhi, the whole idea of loving energy rather than all the hate energy and the uptight and jealousy and all that energy that exists in man, as opposed to the other energy. Both energies are there, only we've tapped and used and played with the defensive one, and we haven't explored in any serious way the loving one. And people, the defense mechanism in your own brain is people get embarrassed the minute you even talk about it. If you said to me, what would you like to be happening in 1984? You know what I mean? In the sense, like, where would you like it to be in 1984? What I would say to that is that if there was the amount of LA happening in 1984 as there is radio happening in 74, as compared to 64, I would think that would be 1,000 times bigger achievement. There are other people trying to get an LA kind of, with their kind of LA thing going. The basic idea is just to get a habit going in your head that becomes a way of life. You're just, on a habitual basis, you are groovier to people. But it's not the fact that you're groovy to people, it's the fact that you get into a habit and that habit results in you being groovy to people. Because the exciting thing about this LADA thing is that the loving consciousness is without a doubt a habit that is conducive to the individual. The individual enjoys the habit at a certain point. Initially difficult, very defensive in his own head about it, embarrassed, won't say it. And that's what I got from jocks at the beginning of it. They said, I wouldn't do it because it's unprofessional, it's not radio, it's not this, it's propaganda, it's political, it's all kinds of reasons for not actually exploring it. And at a certain point then they did, and they got into it, and they're still, it's still going on now. There's an exploration going on, which is very exciting.
You're tuned to the voice of peace and good music, coming live from the North Sea all through the night on 259 meters medium wave.
Radio Caroline.
Nummer 1. Radio Mi Amigo, the best damn station in the world.
De Suzy Wafels, de Suzy Wafels.
Suzy Wafels, steeds de beste. Voor jong en oud, van 's morgens tot 's avonds. Suzy Wafels op de tafel.
De Suzy Wafels, de Suzy Wafels.
Good morning, Radio Mi Amigo.
Goedemorgen iedereen, goedemorgen Albert. Ik moet wel zeggen dat ik over het algemeen nogal zeeziek word, maar ik moet zeggen dat het me hier top bevalt.
Dit is Radio Mi Amigo en dit is de Norbert Show.
Mi Amigo International presents The Norbert Show.
Het is niet normaal.
Joop Verhoef Show, Mi Amigo.
Ik ben Marleen. Weet u, toen ik trouwde was ik de mooiste bruid. En weet u waarom? Ik kocht mijn bruidskleed bij Miss Sheila.
Miss Sheila, Smedestraat 33 te Brugge, Markt 89 Eeklo, Sint-Pieters-Nieuwstraat 2 te Gent. Miss Sheila, met modellen uit Nederland, Duitsland.
En exclusief Annie Roos Paris.
Miss Sheila.
Bennett for you, burn Bennett for you. Oh me amigo, burn Bennett for you. Yuppie, yuppie, yuppie! Yuppie, 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 yuppie.
Het volgende nummer van Joepie met 118 verschillende 4-kleurenstickers.
Yuppie! Zomertijd is Wally's tijd, tijd voor jeans en jackets.
Wally's Jeans and Jackets.
Zomertijd is Wally's tijd. Mi amigo, mi amigo, mi amigo, radio.
Nieuw bij Suzy.
Suzy wafels.
Dit is de beste. De lekkere suikerwafels. Bedekt met een laagje heerlijke chocolade.
Formidabel zeg! 4 wafels in 1 doosje.
Elk pakje gratis 1 4-kleurensticker.
Suzy.
De echte, malse suikerwafels met chocolade.
Maak morgens goedemorgen. Goedemorgen. Hey mi amigo, hey mi amigo, hey mi amigo, hey. Goedemiddag.
Dat was het precisietijdeind van 12 uur. Dit is Radio Miamico Internationaal, uitzendend op 259 meter in de middengolf. En dat komt overeen met een frequentie van 1187 kilohertz. Geachte luisteraars, binnen enkele minuten zal Stan Haag een korte verklaring afleggen.
Luisteraars, in een tijdsbestek van 1 à 2 minuten wil ik u proberen duidelijk te maken waarom Miamico doorgaat met uitzenden. Hetgeen ik nu ga zeggen, zeg ik mede namens de directie van Miamico, de medewerkers aan boord van ons zendschip en mijn collega's discjockeys hier in Spanje, te weten Joop Verhoof, Bert Bennett en Peter van Dam. Ons streven is erop gericht een groot deel van de bevolking verstrooiing te brengen. Ongecompliceerd luisterplezier in een horizontale programmering. Dit nu is een moeilijke zaak, wetende dat de Nederlandse en Belgische wet hier tegen optreedt. Miamico mag niet in de lucht, maar Miamico is in de lucht. Ondanks alle tegenwerking willen wij trachten dit zo te houden. U, ontelbaar aantal luisteraars, heeft hier recht op. De consequentie die dit met zich meebrengt, wordt door ons geaccepteerd. Wij voelen ons geen misdadigers. Wij voelen ons geen onderwereldfiguren die verboden dingen doen. Wij houden rekening met u en wij verwachten niet behandeld te worden als mensen met een criminele inslag. Na 1 september, de fatale datum voor Radio Veronica, Radio Noordzee en Atlantis, bent u tot de ontdekking gekomen dat er een leegte is ontstaan.
It transformed a basically non-music country. I mean, this is how I feel about it, into a fairly high music country. I mean, it's that big a change. It provided musical influence on the public and on young musicians who were coming up in the business. It laid a musical culture on them that they hadn't experienced before. You know, the whole Motown soul thing, which we at that stage were very into. You know, at the beginning, you know, we played all the Motown. We established Motown in the UK. I mean, absolutely. You know, plus it gave exposure to an enormous number of groups who would never have had exposure. I mean, there just wasn't physically anywhere to expose them. So, obviously, today there are something like 100 record companies operating in the UK. There were 4 10 years ago. So, that gives you some idea of the impact, of the. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that had Caroline not existed, had Caroline not done that, then there would not be. I mean, I can positively say there would not be the number of record companies today, and I'm absolutely sure there would not be commercial radio. I mean, no way would commercial radio have happened without Caroline.
First thing it achieved was that it took the BBC by the scruff of the neck and it put it up against the wall and showed them what radio in the mid-1960s was meant to be all about. The net result right now is Radio 1. Our commercial stations around the country are a direct result of what Caroline and the other extra-legal stations achieved.
No, I think they would probably say Radio 1 was influenced by the Pirates. I think they would probably agree to that. Grudgingly, they would agree to it. It's so sad about, maybe it's sad about human nature, I suppose, that people, will exploit and rip off and not ever. I mean, it's interesting also that in all that time, no BBC or government or anybody ever even suggested having a dialogue with me or anybody connected with me. And the setting of that whole, I mean, they just came in, took all our disc jockeys, all our ideas, the whole thing, without even so much as let's have a chat about it, which I think is, does, I don't know, it makes you feel a bit pessimistic about human nature,
I think during the 60s when Caroline was on the air, it broke a lot of artists such as Tom Jones and most of the bands that came after the Beatles and the Stones. And when we came back on the air for the second time in the 70s, it took us a time to get established, but once we did, we then started to make bands and singers become more famous. And a few of the names that spring to mind are Lou Reed, and we played his Walk on the Wild Side quite a lot. Also, I think we broke Focus, and also, of course, Barclay James Harvest.
Love and good music, Radio Caroline. On 259.
The engine room nowadays is completely different to what it was before. In the old days it was messy, there were tools all over the place, and all sorts of ridiculous things going on down there. Nowadays, it's immaculate. I've really never seen anything better. It's got all the tools up on the wall, everything's handy, the generators are all polished, they look brand new, some of them are of course. The floor's beautifully clean. It really is a wonder. I mean, if anyone comes on board, you can immediately say, well, I'll take you down to the engine room, show you that, because it really is something that's come along an awful long way from where it was before. Otherwise, for the cabins, it's mostly up to the people who live in them, and usually round about summertime when we have a lot of nice weather and calm seas, everyone suddenly gets the urge to sort of go down and do something to their cabin, might sort of repaint the walls or something. We've tried to get some new carpet on board to make it more livable in, but the studio hasn't changed all that much, I suppose. It's still got the same sort of equipment in that was in there before, which is very simple equipment and nothing particularly flash, but it works. That's the main thing. It's got a very nice atmosphere, which is difficult to describe unless you're actually there, because it's got the sort of Caroline vibe about it, which I think is, you never find it anywhere else. I haven't anyway. It's very small, but it's had a sort of it's been redecorated, I should say, quite a few times, because we used to have pictures of the royal family up on one side, and in front of us we got things like car stickers and stickers from Capital Radio or LBC or Radio City, various other stations. And of course the studio mostly is filled up with record racks and also racks for DJs' mail and stuff. So there isn't really a lot of room to put anything because it's quite small, makes it a sort of intimate surroundings, which is of course much better for when you get to actually doing a thing in there. It makes it much more sort of homely. You get the sort of closeness of it. All in all, to sort of sum up, I think it's totally changed from 2 years ago. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be on there, you know. We've got all the comforts of home, really.
The report that had come out, the government report that had come out in 1962, to say there was absolutely no evidence that there was any need for all-day music, you know, station, was just complete and absolute hogwash. The Pilkington thing, which was basically a government group who absolutely, you know, had no idea at all what, in fact, the people wanted. I mean, they were totally, not 10% wrong, they were 110% wrong. Which, if that is carried across the whole field of government, then things are in pretty bad shape. I mean, in other words, if all the committees that are set up are even half as wrong as that committee was, we're in bad shape. I mean, basically, because of what tends to happen is that they pick these people out of some kind of payoffs for past efforts or whatever. And so you have a whole lot of these kind of, I mean, I don't even know who Pilkington was, the glass man or something. I mean, what he's got to do with radio, I don't know. But, you know, they pick these committees to pay off sort of political debts, as it were, as far as one can gather. And therefore, you know, they're not really the kind of people that should have been on the committee to make the decision, you know, whether or not. And how you make a decision that the thing is not wanted without experimenting would be very easy to set up even a local area and say we're going to take East Anglia or something, we're going to set a station up and put it in a truck and blast it out around the 10-mile area, sort of a Radio Caroline in East Anglia. And we're going to have an experiment for 1 year, and at the end of the year we're going to interview everybody in that area and say, would you like, you know, this happening would you like this happening on a continuous basis? And, you know, no question, 90% would have, well, 90, 70, 80% would have said yes. And, you know, these are things that are, you know, out of the whole exercise. Anyway, you know, then I suppose that's that one. Caroline Star, incredible response, and a very big response from the government as well, obviously. And they got really, you know, because they just said, no, it's not needed. So there was a big response from them. You know, just the usual bureaucracy response to something that's new and healthy, you know. And, you know, they tried all kinds of things to block it. Of course, the Tories weren't as fanatical. But when the Labour people came in, my God, I mean, it was, I mean, one of their biggest, if you think about it, I mean, the only thing I can remember, I mean, a lot of people, one of the biggest things they did between 64 and 70, I mean, the one thing you can remember there was a definite change was they passed a law against us. I mean, that seems to be their big, I mean, the House, every time the second reading of the Marine Offences Act, it was packed house. I mean, it was like a three-line whip, the whole works. I mean, they really were fanatical about, I mean, they even overrode the democratic rights of the Isle of Man. I mean, the House of Keys in the Isle of Man, democratically elected parliament, second oldest parliament in the world, older than the English parliament even, voted to throw the Marine Offences Act out. I mean, they actually voted to throw it out, and they were overridden by an order in council, which, you know, Wilson used the Queen in that situation, the Labour Prime Minister using, you know, suddenly wanting to use the royalty idea quickly to, you know, to override the democratic rights of the Isle of Man in order to block Caroline. I mean, quite incredible. I mean, quite incredible sort of paranoia about the idea of people actually having the freedom to express themselves through a non-governmental control situation. There's absolute paranoia, and it seems to happen with socialists, because the whole socialist package only works on the basis that they control what you think, what you eat, what you do, where you work, and everything about it. I mean, and you know, they control education, they control everything about you, because if they once open it up to a free choice thing, they're wiped out. And I do believe that, you know, Caroline had a big influence on the youth of the UK. I mean, I believe it. A lot of other people also believe it. So, I think, it's reasonable to assume we did have an effect. How much of a change, how much influence, etc., we never know. There's no way of measuring it exactly. It's what people think and what people have in their heads. But there's no doubt in my mind that the influence was great.
From a point at sea to the circles in your mind, this is the new Radio Caroline.
Once again, Radio Caroline is alone. She is still playing good music and striving for her freedom. But now she has a new consciousness, loving awareness.